at his head, so that he could be only heard, not seen. But the deep, regular breathing, still going on while the other was taking off his worn shoes and gaiters, and still continuing when he had laid aside his coat and cravat, became at length a strong provocative to curiosity and incentive to get a glimpse of the sleeper's face. The waking traveller, therefore, stole a little nearer, and yet a little nearer, and a little nearer to the sleeping traveller's bed, until he stood close beside it. Even then he could not see his face, for he had drawn the sheet over it. The regular breathing still continuing, he put his smooth white hand, such a treacherous hand it looked, as it went creeping from him, to the sheet, and gently lifted it away. "Death of my soul," he whispered, falling back. "Here's Cavaletto." The little Italian, previously influenced in his sleep, perhaps by the stealthy presence at his bedside, stopped by his regular breathing, and with a long, deep respiration opened his eyes. At first they were not awake, though open. He lay for some seconds looking placidly at his old prison companion, and then all at once, with a cry of surprise and alarm, sprang out of bed. "Hush! What's the matter? Keep quiet. It is I. You know me," cried the other in a suppressed voice. But Jean-Baptiste, widely staring, muttering a number of invocations and ejaculations, tremblingly backing into a corner, slipping on his trousers, and trying his coat by the two sleeves round his neck, manifested an unmistakable desire to escape by the door rather than renew the acquaintance. Seeing this, his old prison comrade fell back upon the door and set his shoulders against it. "Cavaletto, wake, boy. Rub your eyes and look at me. Not the same you used to call me. Don't use that. Lanier. Say Lanier." Jean-Baptiste, staring at him with eyes opened to their utmost width, made a number of those national backhanded shakes of the right forefinger in the air, as if he were resolved on negativing beforehand everything that the other could possibly advance during the whole term of his life. "Cavaletto, give me your hand. You know, Lanier, the gentleman. Touch the hand of a gentleman." Submitting himself to the old tone of condescending authority, Jean-Baptiste, not at all steady on his legs as yet, advanced and put his hand in his patron's. Monsieur Lanier laughed, and having given it a squeeze, tossed it up and let it go. "Then you were—" faltered Jean-Baptiste. "Not shaved. No, see here," cried Lanier, giving his head a twirl, "as tight on as your own." Jean-Baptiste, with a slight shiver, looked all round the room as if to recall where he was. His patron took that opportunity of turning the key in the door, and then sat down upon his bed. "Look," he said, holding up his shoes and gaiters. "That's a poor trim for a gentleman, you'll say. No matter, you shall see how soon I'll mend it. Come and sit down. Take your old place." Jean-Baptiste, looking anything but reassured, sat down on the floor at the bedside, keeping his eyes upon his patron all the time. "That's well," cried Lanier. "Now we might be in the old infernal hole again, eh? How long have you been out?" "2 days after you, my master." "How come you here?" "I was cautioned not to stay there, and so I left the town at once, and since then I have changed about. I have been doing odds and ends at Avignon, at Pont-Esprit, at Lyon, upon the Rhone, upon the Saône." As he spoke, he rapidly mapped the places out with his sunburnt hand upon the floor. "And where are you going?" "Going, my master?" "Aye." Jean-Baptiste seemed to desire to evade the question without knowing how. "By Bacchus," he said at last, as if he were forced to the admission, "I have sometimes had a thought of going to Paris, and perhaps to England." "Cavaletto, this is in confidence. I am also going to Paris, and perhaps to England. We'll go together." The little man nodded his head and showed his teeth, and yet seemed not quite convinced that it was a surpassingly desirable arrangement. "We'll go together," repeated Lanier. "You shall see how soon I will force myself to be recognized as a gentleman, and you shall profit by it. It is agreed, are we one?" "Oh, surely, surely," said the little man. "Then you shall hear before I sleep, and in 6 words, for I want sleep, how I appear before you. I, Lanier. Remember that, not the other." Altro, not Before Jean-Baptiste could finish the name, his comrade had got his hand under his chin and fiercely shut up his mouth. Death, what are you doing? Do you want me to be trampled upon and stoned? Do you want to be trampled upon and stoned? You would be. You don't imagine that they would set upon me and let my prison chum go. Don't think it. There was an expression in his face as he released his grip of his friend's jaw, from which his friend inferred that if the course of events really came to any stoning and trampling, Monsieur Lanier would so distinguish him with his notice as to ensure his having his full share of it. He remembered what a cosmopolitan gentleman Monsieur Lanier was, and how few weak distinctions he made. I am a man, said Monsieur Lanier, whom society has deeply wronged since you last saw me. You know that I am sensitive and brave, and that it is my character to govern. How has society respected those qualities in me? I have been shrieked at through the streets. I have been guarded through the streets against men, and especially women, running at me armed with any weapons they could lay their hands on. I have lain in prison for security, with the place of my confinement kept a secret, lest I should be torn out of it and felled by 100 blows. I have been carted out of Marseille in the dead of night and carried leagues away from it packed in straw. It has not been safe for me to go near my house, and, with a beggar's pittance in my pocket, I have walked through vile mud and weather ever since, until my feet are crippled. Look at them. Such are the humiliations that society has inflicted upon me, possessing the qualities I have mentioned, and which you know me to possess. But society shall pay for it. All this he said in his companion's ear, and with his hand before his lips. Even here, he went on in the same way, even in this mean drinking shop, society pursues me. Madame defames me, and her guests defame me. I, too, a gentleman with manners and accomplishments, to strike them dead, but the wrong society has heaped upon me are treasured in this breast. To all of which Jean-Baptiste, listening attentively to the suppressed hoarse voice, said from time to time, Surely, surely, tossing his head and shutting his eyes, as if there were the clearest case against society that perfect candour could make out. Put my shoes there, continued Lanier. Hang my cloak to dry by the door. Take my hat. He obeyed each instruction as it was given. And this is the bed to which society consigns me, is it? Very well. As he stretched out his length upon it, with a ragged handkerchief bound between his wicked head, and only his wicked head showing above the bedclothes, Jean-Baptiste was rather strongly reminded of what had so very nearly happened to prevent the moustaches from any more going up as it did, and the nose from any more coming down as it did. Shaken out of destiny's dice-box again into your company, eh? By heaven, so much the better for you. You'll profit by it. I shall need a long rest. Let me sleep in the morning. Jean-Baptiste replied that he should sleep as long as he would, and wishing him a happy night, put out the candle. One might have supposed that the next proceeding of the Italian would have been to undress, but he did exactly the reverse, and dressed himself from head to foot, saving his shoes. When he had done so, he lay down upon his bed with some of its coverings over him, and his coat still tied round his neck to get through the night. When he started up, the godfather break of day was peeping at its namesake. He rose, took his shoes in his hand, turned the key in the door with great caution, and crept downstairs. Nothing was astir there but the smell of coffee, wine, tobacco, and syrups, and Madame's little counter looked ghastly enough. But he had paid Madame his little note at it overnight, and wanted to see nobody, wanted nothing but to get on his shoes and his knapsack, open the door, and run away. He prospered in his object. No movement or voice was heard when he opened the door. No wicked head, tied up in a ragged handkerchief, looked out of the upper window. When the sun had raised his full disk above the flat line of the horizon, and was striking fire out of the long muddy vista of paved road with its weary avenue of little trees, a black speck moved along the road and splashed among the flaming pools of rainwater. Which black speck was Jean-Baptiste Cavaletto, running away from his patron. Chapter 12. Bleeding Heart Yard. In London itself, though in the old rustic road towards a suburb of note, where in the days of William Shakespeare, author and stage player, there were royal hunting seats, howbeit no sport is left there now but for hunters of men, Bleeding Heart Yard was to be found, a place much changed in feature and in fortune, yet with some relish of ancient greatness about it. 2 or 3 mighty stacks of chimneys, and a few large dark rooms which had escaped being walled and subdivided out of the recognition of their old proportions, gave the yard a character. It was inhabited by poor people, who set up their rest among its faded glories, as Arabs of the desert pitch their tents among the fallen stones of the pyramids. But there was a family sentimental feeling prevalent in the yard, that it had a character. As if the aspiring city had become puffed up in the very ground on which it stood, the ground had so risen about Bleeding Heart Yard that you got into it down a flight of steps which formed no part of the original approach, and got out of it by a low gateway into a maze of shabby streets, which went about and about, tortuously ascending to the level again. At this end of the yard and over the gateway was the factory of Daniel Doyce, often heavily beating like a bleeding heart of iron, with the clink of metal upon metal. The opinion of the yard was divided respecting the derivation of its name. The more practical of its inmates abided by the tradition of a murder. The gentler and more imaginative inhabitants, including the whole of the tender sex, were loyal to the legend of a young lady of former times, closely imprisoned in her chamber by a cruel father for remaining true to her own true love, and refusing to marry the suitor he chose for her. The legend related how that the young lady used to be seen up at her window behind the bars, murmuring a lovelorn song of which the burden was, bleeding heart, bleeding away, until she died. It was objected by the murderous party that this refrain was notoriously the invention of a tambour worker, a spinster and romantic, still lodging in the yard. But forasmuch as all favourite legends must be associated with the affections, and as many more people fall in love than commit murder, which it may be hoped, howsoever bad we are, will continue until the end of the world to be the dispensation under which we shall live, the bleeding heart, bleeding away story carried the day by a great majority. Neither party would listen to the antiquaries who delivered learned lectures in the neighbourhood, showing the bleeding heart to have been the heraldic cognizance of the old family to whom the property had once belonged. And considering that the hourglass they turned from year to year was filled with the earthiest and coarsest sand, the Bleeding Heart Yarders had reason enough for objecting to be despoiled of the one little golden grain of poetry that sparkled in it. Down into the yard, by the way of the steps, came Daniel Doyce, Mr. Meagles, and Clennam. Passing along the yard and between the open doors on either hand, all abundantly garnished with light children nursing heavy ones, they arrived at its opposite boundary, the gateway. Here Arthur Clennam stopped to look about him for the domicile of Plornish, plasterer, whose name, according to the custom of Londoners, Daniel Doyce had never seen or heard of to that hour. It was plain enough, nevertheless, as little Dorrit had said, over a lime-splashed gateway in the corner, within which Plornish kept a ladder and a barrel or two. The last house in Bleeding Heart Yard, which he had described as his place of habitation, was a large house, let off to various tenants, but Plornish ingeniously hinted that he lived in the parlour, by means of a painted hand under his name, the forefinger of which hand, on which the artist had depicted a ring and a most elaborate nail of the genteelest form, referred all inquirers to that apartment. Parting from his companions after arranging another meeting with Mr. Meagles, Clennam went alone into the entry, and knocked with his knuckles at the parlour door. It was opened presently by a woman with a child in her arms, whose unoccupied hand was hastily rearranging the upper part of her dress. This was Mrs. Plornish, and this maternal action was the action of Mrs. Plornish during a large part of her waking existence. "Was Mr. Plornish at home?" "Well, sir," said Mrs. Plornish, a civil woman, "not to deceive you, he's gone to look for a job." Not to deceive you was a method of speech which Mrs. Plornish, she would deceive you under any circumstances, as little as might be, but she had a trick of answering in this provisional form. "Do you think he will be back soon, if I wait for him?" "I have been expecting him," said Mrs. Plornish, "this half an hour, at any minute of time. Walk in, sir." Arthur entered the rather dark and close parlour, though it was lofty too, and sat down in the chair she placed for him. "Not to deceive you, sir, I notice it," said Mrs. Plornish, "and I take it kind of you." He was at a loss to understand what she meant, and by expressing as much in looks, elicited her explanation. "It ain't many times that comes into a poor place that deems it worth their while to move their hats," said Mrs. Plornish, "but people think more of it than people think." Clennam returned with an uncomfortable feeling in so very slight a courtesy being unusual. Was that all? And stooping down to pinch the cheek of another young child who was sitting on the floor, staring at him, asked Mrs. Plornish how old that fine boy was. 4 year just turned, sir," said Mrs. Plornish. "He is a fine little fellow, ain't he, sir? But this one is rather sickly." She tenderly hushed the baby in her arms as she said it. "You wouldn't mind my asking if it happened to be a job as you was come about, sir, would you?" asked Mrs. Plornish wistfully. She asked it so anxiously that if it had been in possession of any kind of tenement, he would have had it plastered a foot deep rather than answer no. But he was obliged to answer no, and he saw a shade of disappointment on her face as she checked a sigh and looked at the low fire. Then he saw also that Mrs. Plornish was a young woman, made somewhat slatternly in herself and her belongings by poverty, and so dragged by poverty and the children together that their united forces had already dragged her face into wrinkles. "All such things as jobs," said Mrs. Plornish, "seems to have gone underground, they do indeed." Herein Mrs. Plornish limited her remark to the plastering trade and spoke without reference to the Circumlocution Office and the Barnacle family. "Is it so difficult to get work?" asked Arthur Clennam. "Plornish finds it so," she returned. "He is quite unfortunate. Really he is. Really he was." He was one of those many wayfarers on the road of life who seem to be afflicted with supernatural corns, rendering it impossible for them to keep up even with their lame competitors. A willing, working, soft-hearted, not hard-hearted fellow, Plornish took his fortune as smoothly as could be expected, but it was a rough one. It so rarely happened that anybody seemed to want him. It was such an exceptional case when his powers were in any request that his misty mind could not make out how it happened. He took it as it came, therefore. He tumbled into all kinds of difficulties and tumbled out of them, and by tumbling through life got himself considerably bruised. "It's not for want of looking after jobs, I'm sure," said Mrs. Plornish, lifting up her eyebrows and searching for a solution of the problem between the bars of the grate, "nor yet for want of working at them when they are to be got. No one ever heard my husband complain of work." Somehow or other, this was the general misfortune of Bleeding Heart Yard. From time to time there were public complaints, pathetically going about, of labour being scarce, which certain people seemed to take extraordinarily ill, as though they had an absolute right to it on their own terms. But Bleeding Heart Yard, though as willing a yard as any in Britain, was never the better for the demand. That high old family, the Barnacles, had long been too busy with their great principle to look into the matter, and indeed the matter had nothing to do with their watchfulness in out-generaling all other high old families except the Stiltstalkings. While Mrs. Plornish spoke in these words of her absent lord, her lord returned, a smooth-cheeked, fresh-coloured, sandy-whiskered man of 30, long in the legs, yielding at the knees, foolish in the face, flannel-jacketed, lime-whitened. "This is Plornish, sir." "I came," said Clennam, rising, "to beg the favour of a little conversation with you on the subject of the Dorrit family." Plornish became suspicious, seemed to scent a creditor. said, "Oh, yes, well, he didn't know what satisfaction he could give any gentleman respecting that family. What might it be about, now?" "I know you better," said Clennam, smiling, "than you suppose." Plornish observed, not smiling in return, and yet he hadn't the pleasure of being acquainted with the gentleman neither. "No," said Arthur, "I know your kind offices at second hand, but on the best authority. Through little Dorrit. I mean," he explained, "Miss Dorrit." "Mr. Clennam, is it? Oh, I've heard of you, sir." "And I of you," said Arthur. "Please sit down again, sir, and consider yourself welcome." "Why, yes," said Plornish, taking a chair and lifting the elder child upon his knee, that he might have the moral support of speaking to a stranger over his head. "I've been on the wrong side of the lock myself, and in that way we come to know Miss Dorrit. Me and my wife, we are well acquainted with Miss Dorrit." "Intimate," cried Mrs. Plornish. Indeed, she was so proud of the acquaintance that she had awakened some bitterness of spirit in the yard by magnifying to an enormous amount the sum for which Miss Dorrit's father had become insolvent. The Bleeding Hearts resented her claiming to know people of such distinction. "It was her father that I got acquainted with first, and through getting acquainted with him, you see, why, I got acquainted with her," said Plornish tautologically. "I see. Ah, and there's manners, there's polish, there's a gentleman to have run to seed in the Marshalsea jail. Why, perhaps you are not aware," said Plornish, lowering his voice and speaking with a perverse admiration of what he ought to have pitied or despised, "not aware that Miss Dorrit and her sister daren't let him know that they work for a living. No," said Plornish, looking with a ridiculous triumph first at his wife and then all round the room. "Daren't let him know. They daren't." "Without admiring him for that," Clennam quietly observed. "I'm very sorry for him." The remark appeared to suggest to Plornish, for the first time, that it might not be a very fine trait of character after all. He pondered about it for a moment, and gave it up. "As to me," he resumed, "certainly Mr. Dorrit is as affable with me, I am sure, as I can possibly expect. Considering the differences and distances betwixt us, more so. But it's Miss Dorrit that we were speaking of." "True. Pray, how did you introduce her at my mother's?" Mr. Plornish picked a bit of lime out of his whisker, put it between his lips, turned it with his tongue like a sugar-plum, considered, found himself unequal to the task of lucid explanation, and appealing to his wife said, "Sally, you may as well mention how it was, old woman." "Miss Dorrit," said Sally, hushing the baby from side to side and laying her chin upon the little hand as it tried to disarrange the gown again, "came here one afternoon with a bit of writing, telling that how she wished for needlework, and asked if it would be considered any ill-convenience in case she was to give her address here." Plornish repeated her address here in a low voice, as if he were making responses at church. "Me and Plornish says, no, Miss Dorrit, no ill-convenience." Plornish repeated, "No ill-convenience." "And she wrote it in according, which then a me and Plornish says, oh, Miss Dorrit." Plornish repeated, "Oh, Miss Dorrit. Have you thought of copying it 3 or 4 times, as the way to make it known in more places than one?" "No," says Miss Dorrit, "I have not, but I will." She copied it out according on his table in a sweet writing, and Plornish, he took it where he worked, having a job just then. Plornish repeated job just then, and likewise to the landlord of the yard, through which it was that Mrs. Clennam first happened to employ Miss Dorrit. Plornish repeated employ Miss Dorrit, and Mrs. Plornish, having come to an end, feigned to bite the fingers of the little hand as she kissed it. "The landlord of the yard," said Arthur Clennam, "He is Mr. Caseby, by name he is," said Plornish, "and Panks, he collects the rents, that," added Mr. Plornish, dwelling on the subject with a slow thoughtfulness that appeared to have no connection with any specific object, and to lead him nowhere, "that is about what they are. You may believe me or not, as you think proper." "Ay," returned Clennam, thoughtful in his turn. "Mr. Caseby, too, an old acquaintance of mine, long ago?" Mr. Plornish did not see his road to any comment on this fact, and made none. As there truly was no reason why he should have the least interest in it, Arthur Clennam went on to the present purport of his visit. namely, to make Plornish the instrument of effecting Tip's release, with as little detriment as possible to the self-reliance and self-helpfulness of the young man, supposing him to possess any remnant of those qualities, without doubt a very wide stretch of supposition. Plornish, having been made acquainted with the cause of action from the defendant's own mouth, gave Arthur to understand that the plaintiff was a chaunter, meaning not a singer of anthems but a seller of horses, and that he, Plornish, considered that 10 shillings in the pound would settle Ansem, and that more would be a waste of money. The principal and instrument soon drove off together to a stable yard in High Holborn, where a remarkably fine grey gelding, worth, at the lowest figure, 75 guineas, not taking into account the value of the shot he had been made to swallow for the improvement of his form, was to be parted with for a £20 note, in consequence of his having run away last week with Mrs. Captain Barbary of Cheltenham, who wasn't up to a horse of his courage, and who, in mere spite, insisted on selling him for that ridiculous sum, or, in other words, on giving him away. Plornish, going up this yard alone and leaving his principal outside, found a gentleman with tight drab legs, a rather old hat, a little hooked stick, and a blue neckerchief, Captain Maroon of Gloucestershire, a private friend of Captain Barbary, who happened to be there, in a friendly way, to mention these little circumstances concerning the remarkably fine grey gelding to any real judge of a horse, and quick snapper-up of a good thing, who might look in at that address as per advertisement. This gentleman, happening also to be the plaintiff in the Tip case, referred Mr. Plornish to his solicitor, and declined to treat with Mr. Plornish, or even to endure his presence in the yard unless he appeared there with a £20 note, in which case only the gentleman would augur from appearances that he meant business, and might be induced to talk to him. On this hint, Mr. Plornish retired to communicate with his principal, and presently came back with the required credentials. Then said Captain Maroon, "Now, how much time do you want to make the other 20 in? Now, I'll give you a month." Then said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit, "Now, I'll tell you what I'll do with you. You shall get me a good bill at 4 months, made payable at a banking house for the other 20. Then said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit, "Now come, here's the last I've got to say to you. You shall give me another 10 down, and I'll run my pen clean through it." Then said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit, "Now, I'll tell you what it is, and this shuts it up. He has used me bad, but I'll let him off for another 5 down and a bottle of wine, and if you mean done, say done, and if you don't like it, leave it." Finally, said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit either, "and over then," and in consideration of the first offer, gave a receipt in full and discharged the prisoner. "Mr. Plornish," said Arthur, "I trust you, if you please, to keep my secret. If you will undertake to let the young man know that he is free, and to tell him that you were employed to compound for the debt by someone whom you are not at liberty to name, you will not only do me a service, but may do him one, and his sister also." "The last reason, sir," said Plornish, "would be quite sufficient. Your wishes shall be attended to. A friend has obtained his discharge, you can say, if you please. A friend who hopes that for his sister's sake, if for no one else's, he will make good use of his liberty. Your wishes, sir, shall be attended to. And if you will be so good in your better knowledge of the family as to communicate freely with me, and to point out to me any means by which you think I may be delicately and really useful to little Dorrit, I shall feel under an obligation to you." "Don't name it, sir," returned Plornish. "It'll be equally a pleasure, and a—" Finding himself unable to balance his sentence after 2 efforts, Mr. Plornish wisely dropped it. He took Clennam's card and appropriate pecuniary compliment. He was earnest to finish his commission at once, and his principal was in the same mind. So his principal offered to set him down at the Marshalsea gate, and they drove in that direction over Blackfriars Bridge. On the way, Arthur elicited from his new friend a confused summary of the interior life of Bleeding Heart Yard. They was all hard up there, Mr. Plornish said, uncommon hard up, to be sure. Well, He couldn't say how it was. He didn't know as anybody could say how it was. All he knowed was that so it was. When a man felt on his own back and in his own belly that poor he was, that man, Mr. Plornish gave it as his decided belief, knowed well that he was poor somehow or another, and you couldn't talk it out of him, no more than you could talk beef into him. Then you see, some people as was better off said, and a good many such people lived pretty close up to the mark themselves, if not beyond it, so he'd heard, that they was improvident. That was the favourite word down the yard. For instance, if they see a man with his wife and children going to Hampton Court in a wan, perhaps once in a year, they says, "Hallo, I thought you was poor, my improvident friend." Why, Lord, how hard it was upon a man. What was a man to do? He couldn't go melancholy mad, and if he did, you wouldn't be the better for it. In Mr. Plornish's judgment, you would be the worse for it, yet you seem to want to make a man melancholy mad. You was always at it, if not with your right hand, with your left. What was they a-doing in the yard? Why, take a look at 'em and see. There was the girls and their mothers a-working at their sewing, or their shoe-binding, or their trimming, or their waistcoat-making, day and night and day, and not more than able to keep body and soul together after all, often not so much. There was people of pretty well all sorts of trades you could name, all wanting to work and yet not able to get it. There was old people, after working all their lives, going and being shut up in the workhouse, much worse fed and lodged and treated altogether than, Mr. Plornish said, manufacturers, but appeared to mean malefactors. Why, a man didn't know where to turn himself for a crumb of comfort. As to who was to blame for it, Mr. Plornish didn't know who was to blame for it. He could tell you who suffered, but he couldn't tell you whose fault it was. It wasn't his place to find out, and who'd mind what he said, if he did find out? He only knowed that it wasn't put right by then what undertook that line of business, and that it didn't come right of itself. And, in brief, his illogical opinion was that if you couldn't do nothing for him, you had better take nothing from him for doing it. So far as he could make out, that was about what it came to. Thus, in a prolix, gently growling, foolish way, did Plornish turn the tangled skein of his estate about and about, like a blind man who was trying to find some beginning or end to it, until they reached the prison gate. There he left his principal alone, to wonder, as he rode away, how many thousand Plornishes there might be within a day or two's journey of the Circumlocution Office, plying sundry curious variations on the same tune, which were not known by ear in that glorious institution. Chapter 13. Patriarchal. The mention of Mr. Casby again revived in Clennam's memory the smouldering embers of curiosity and interest which Mrs. Flintwich had fanned on the night of his arrival. Flora Casby had been the beloved of his boyhood, and Flora was the daughter and only child of wooden-headed old Christopher. So he was still occasionally spoken of by some irreverent spirits who had had dealings with him, and in whom familiarity had bred its proverbial result, perhaps, who was reputed to be rich in weekly tenants, and to get a good quantity of blood out of the stones of several unpromising courts and alleys. After some days of inquiry and research, Arthur Clennam became convinced that the case of the father of the Marshalsea was indeed a hopeless one, and sorrowfully resigned the idea of helping him to freedom again. He had no hopeful inquiry to make at present concerning little Dorrit either, but he argued with himself that it might, for anything he knew, it might be serviceable to the poor child if he renewed this acquaintance. It is hardly necessary to add that beyond all doubt he would have presented himself at Mr. Casby's door if there had been no little Dorrit in existence. For we all know how we all deceive ourselves, that is to say, how people in general, our profounder selves excepted, deceive themselves, as to motives of action. With a comfortable impression upon him, and quite an honest one in its way, that he was still patronizing little Dorrit in doing what he had no reference to her, he found himself one afternoon at the corner of Mr. Casby's street. Mr. Casby lived in a street in the Gray's Inn Road, which had set off from the thoroughfare with that intention of running at one heat down into the valley and up again at the top of Pentonville Hill, but which had run itself out of breath in 20 yards, and had stood still ever since. There is no such place in that part now, but it remained there for many years, looking with a balked countenance at the wilderness patched and unfruitful gardens and pimpled with eruptive summer-houses that it had meant to run over in no time. The house, thought Clennam as he crossed to the door, is as little changed as my mother's, and looks almost as gloomy, but the likeness ends outside. I know its staid repose within. The smell of its jars of old rose leaves and lavender seems to come upon me even here. When his knock at the bright brass knocker of obsolete shape brought a woman servant to the door, those faded scents in truth saluted him like wintry breath that had a faint remembrance in it of the bygone spring. He stepped into the sober, silent, airtight house. One might have fancied it had been stifled by mutes in the Eastern manner, and the door, closing again, seemed to shut out sound and motion. The furniture was formal, grave, and Quaker-like, but well kept, and had as prepossessing an aspect as anything, from a human creature to a wooden stool, that is meant for much use and is preserved for little, can ever wear. There was a grave clock ticking somewhere up the staircase, and there was a songless bird in the same direction, pecking at his cage, as if he were ticking too. The parlour fire ticked in the grate. There was only one person in the parlour hearth, and the loud watch in his pocket ticked audibly. The servant maid had ticked the 2 words Mr. Clennam so softly that she had not been heard, and he consequently stood within the door she had closed, unnoticed. The figure of a man advanced in life, whose smooth grey eyebrows seemed to move to the ticking as the firelight flickered on them, sat in an armchair with his list shoes on the rug and his thumbs slowly revolving over one another. This was old Christopher Casby, recognizable at a glance, as unchanged in 20 years and upward as his own solid furniture, as little touched by the influence of the varying seasons as the old rose leaves and old lavender in his porcelain jars. Perhaps there never was a man in this troublesome world so troublesome for the imagination to picture as a boy. And yet he had changed very little in his progress through life. Confronting him in the room in which he sat was a boy's portrait, which anybody seeing him would have identified as Master Christopher Casby, aged 10, though disguised with a haymaking rake, for which he had had at any time as much taste or use as for a diving bell, and sitting on one of his own legs upon a bank of violets, moved to precocious contemplation by the spire of a village church. There was the same smooth face and forehead, the same calm blue eye, the same placid air, the shining bald head, which looked so very large because it shone so much, and the long grey hair at its sides and back, like floss silk or spun glass, which looked so very benevolent because it was never cut, were not, of course, to be seen in the boy as in the old man. Nevertheless, in the seraphic creature with the haymaking rake were clearly to be discerned the rudiments of the patriarch with the list shoes. Patriarch was the name which many people delighted to give him. Various old ladies in the neighbourhood spoke of him as the last of the patriarchs. So grey, so slow, so quiet, so impassionate, so very bumpy in the head, patriarch was the word for him. He had been accosted in the streets, and respectfully solicited to become a patriarch for painters and for sculptors, with so much importunity, in sooth, that it would appear to be beyond the fine arts to remember the points of a patriarch or to invent one. Philanthropists of both sexes had asked who he was, and on being informed old Christopher Casby formerly town agent to Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle, had cried in a rapture of disappointment, "Oh, why, with that head, is he not a benefactor to his species? Oh, why, with that head, is he not a father to the orphan and a friend to the friendless?" With that head, however, he remained old Christopher Casby, proclaimed by common report rich in house property, and with that head he now sat in his silent parlour. Indeed, it would be the height of unreason to expect him to be sitting there without that head. Arthur Clennam moved to attract his attention, and the grey eyebrows turned towards him. "I beg pardon," said Clennam. "I fear you did not hear me announced." "No, sir, I did not. Do you wish to see me, sir?" "I wish to pay my respects." Mr. Casby seemed a feather's weight disappointed by the last words, having perhaps prepared himself for the visitor's wishing to pay something else. "Have I the pleasure, sir," he proceeded. "Take a chair, if you please. Have I the pleasure of knowing— Ah, truly, yes, I think I have. I believe I am not mistaken in supposing that I am acquainted with those features. I think I address a gentleman of whose return to this country I was informed by Mr. Flintwich." "That is your present visitor." "Really, Mr. Clennam?" "No other, Mr. Casby." "Mr. Clennam, I am glad to see you. How have you been since we met?" Without thinking it worth while to explain that in the course of some quarter of a century he had experienced occasional slight fluctuations in his health and spirits, Clennam answered generally that he had never been better, or something equally to the purpose, and shook hands with the possessor of that head as it shed its patriarchal light upon him. "We are older, Mr. Clennam," said Christopher Casby. "We are not younger," said Clennam. After this wise remark he felt that he was scarcely shining with brilliancy, and became aware that he was nervous. "And your respected father," said Mr. Casby, "is no more. I was grieved to hear it, Mr. Clennam. I was grieved." Arthur replied in the usual way that he felt infinitely obliged to him. "There was a time," said Mr. Casby, "when your parents and myself were not on friendly terms. There was a little family misunderstanding among us. Your respected mother was rather jealous of her son, maybe. When I say her son, I mean your worthy self, your worthy self." His smooth face had a bloom upon it like ripe wall fruit. What with his blooming face and that head, and his blue eyes, he seemed to be delivering sentiments of rare wisdom and virtue. In like manner, his physiognomical expression seemed to teem with benignity. Nobody could have said where the wisdom was, or where the virtue was, or where the benignity was, but they all seemed to be somewhere about him. "Those times, however," pursued Mr. Casby, "are past and gone, past and gone. I do myself the pleasure of making a visit to your respected mother occasionally, and of admiring the fortitude and strength of mind with which she bears her trials. When he made one of these little repetitions, sitting with his hands crossed before him, he did it with his head on one side and a gentle smile, as if he had something in his thoughts too sweetly profound to put into words, as if he denied himself the pleasure of uttering it, lest he should soar too high, and his meekness therefore preferred to be unmeaning. "I have heard that you were kind enough on one of those occasions," said Arthur, catching at the opportunity as it drifted past him, "to mention little Dorrit to my mother." "Little Dorrit?" "That's the seamstress who was mentioned to me by a small tenant of mine. Yes, Dorrit, that's the name. Ah, yes, you call her Little Dorrit." No road in that direction. Nothing came of the cross-cut. It led no further. "My daughter Flora," said Mr. Casby, "as you may have heard probably, Mr. Clennam, was married and established in life several years ago. She had the misfortune to lose her husband when she had been married a few months. She resides with me again. She will be glad to see you if you will permit me to let her know that you are here." "By all means," returned Clennam. I should have preferred the request if your kindness had not anticipated me." Upon this, Mr. Casby rose up in his list shoes, and with a slow, heavy step, he was of an elephantine build, made for the door. He had a long, wide-skirted bottle green coat on, and a bottle green pair of trousers, and a bottle green waistcoat. The patriarchs were not dressed in bottle green broadcloth, and yet his clothes looked patriarchal. He had scarcely left the room and allowed the ticking to become audible again, when a quick hand turned a latchkey in the house door, opened it and shut it. Immediately afterwards, a quick and eager, short, dark man came into the room with so much way upon him that he was within a foot of Clennam before he could stop. "Halloa," he said. Clennam saw no reason why he should not say "halloa" too. "What's the matter?" said the short, dark man. "I have not heard that anything is the matter," returned Clennam. "Where's Mr. Casby?" asked the short, dark man, looking about. "He will be here directly if you want him." "I want him," said the short, dark man. "Don't you?" This elicited a word or two of explanation from Clennam, during the delivery of which the short, dark man held his breath and looked at him. He was dressed in black and rusty iron grey, had jet-black beads of eyes, a scrubby little black chin, wiry black hair striking out from his head in prongs, like forks or hairpins, and a complexion that was very dingy by nature, or very dirty by art, or a compound of nature and art. He had dirty hands and dirty broken nails, and looked as if he had been in the coals. He was in a perspiration, and snorted and sniffed and puffed and blew like a little labouring steam-engine. "Oh," said he, when Arthur told him how he came to be there. "Very well, that's right. If he should ask for Panks, will you be so good as to say that Panks is come in?" And so, with a short and a puff, he worked out by another door. Now, in the old days, at home, certain audacious doubts respecting the last of the patriarchs, which were afloat in the air, had, by some forgotten means, come in contact with Arthur's sensorium. He was aware of motes and specks of suspicion in the atmosphere of that time, seen through which medium Christopher Casby was a mere inn signpost without any inn, an invitation to rest and be thankful when there was no place to put up at, and nothing whatever to be thankful for. He knew that some of these specks even represented Christopher as capable of harbouring designs in that head, and as being a crafty impostor. Other motes there were which showed him as a heavy, selfish, drifting booby, who, having stumbled in the course of his unwieldy jostlings against other men, on the discovery that to get through life with ease and credit, he had but to hold his tongue, keep the bald part of his head well polished, and leave his hair alone, had just cunning enough to seize the idea and stick to it. It was said that his being town agent to Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle was referable, not to his having the least business capacity, but to his looking so supremely benignant that nobody could suppose the property screwed or jobbed under such a man, also that for similar reasons he now got more money out of his own wretched lettings, unquestioned, than anybody with a less knobby and less shining crown could possibly have done. In a word, it was represented, Clennam called to mind, alone in the ticking parlour, that many people select their models much as the painters, just now mentioned, select theirs, and that, whereas in the Royal Academy some evil old ruffian of a dog-stealer will annually be found embodying all the cardinal virtues on account of his eyelashes, or his chin, or his legs, thereby planting thorns of confusion in the breasts of the more observant students of nature, so, in the great social exhibition, accessories are often accepted in lieu of the internal character. Calling these things to mind, and ranging Mr. Panks in a row with them, Arthur Clennam leaned this day to the opinion, without quite deciding on it, that the last of the patriarchs was the drifting booby aforesaid, with the one idea of keeping the bald part of his head highly polished, and that, much as an unwieldy ship in the Thames River may sometimes be seen heavily driving with the tide broadside on, stern first, in its own way and in the way of everything else, though making a great show of navigation, when all of a sudden a little coaly steam tug will bear down upon it, take it in tow, and bustle off with it. Similarly, the cumbrous Patriarch had been taken in tow by the snorting Panks, and was now following in the wake of that dingy little craft. The return of Mr. Casby with his daughter Flora put an end to these meditations. Clennam's eyes no sooner fell upon the subject of his old passion than it shivered and broke to pieces. Most men will be found sufficiently true to themselves to be true to an old idea. It is no proof of an inconstant mind, but exactly the opposite, when the idea will not bear close comparison with the reality, and the contrast is a fatal shock to it. Such was Clennam's case. In his youth he had ardently loved this woman, and had heaped upon her all the locked-up wealth of his affection and imagination. That wealth had been in his desert home like Robinson Crusoe's money, exchangeable with no one, lying idle in the dark to rust until he poured it out for her. Ever since that memorable time, though he had, until the night of his arrival, as completely dismissed her from any association with his present or future as if she had been dead, which she might easily have been for anything he knew, he had kept the old fancy of the past unchanged in its old sacred place. And now, after all, the last of the patriarchs coolly walked into the parlour, saying in effect, "Be good enough to throw it down and dance upon it. This is Flora." Flora, always tall, had grown to be very broad, too, and short of breath, but that was not much. Flora, whom he had left a lily, had become a peony, but that was not much. Flora, who had seemed enchanting in all she said and thought, was diffuse and silly. That was much. Flora, who had been spoiled and artless long ago, was determined to be spoilt and artless now. That was a fatal blow. This is Flora. "I am sure," giggled Flora, tossing her head with a caricature of her girlish manner, such as a mamma might have presented at her own funeral, if she had lived and died in classical antiquity. "I am ashamed to see Mr. Clennam. I am a mere fright. I know he'll find me fearfully changed. I am actually an old woman. It's shocking to be found out. It's really shocking." He assured her that she was just what he had expected, and that time had not stood still with himself. "Oh, but with gentlemen it's so different, and really you look so amazingly well, you have no right to say anything of the kind. While as to me, you know—" "Oh," cried Flora with a little scream, "I am dreadful." The patriarch, apparently not yet understanding his own part in the drama, under representation, glowed with vacant serenity. "But if we talk of not having changed," said Flora, who, whatever she said, never once came to a full stop, "look at Papa. Is not Papa precisely what he was when you went away? Isn't it cruel and unnatural to Papa to be such a reproach to his own child? If we go on in this way much longer, people who don't know us will begin to suppose that I am Papa's mamma." "That must be a long time hence," Arthur considered. "Oh, Mr. Clennam, you insincerest of creatures," said Flora. "I perceive already you have not lost your old way of paying compliments, your old way when you used to pretend to be so sentimentally struck, you know. At least, I don't mean that. I don't know what I mean." Here Flora tittered confusedly, and gave him one of her old glances. The patriarch, as if he now began to perceive that his part in the piece was to get off the stage as soon as might be, rose and went to the door by which Panks had worked out, hailing that tug by name. He received an answer from some little dock beyond, and was towed out of sight directly. "You mustn't think of going yet," said Flora. Arthur had looked at his hat, being in a ludicrous dismay and not knowing what to do. "You could never be so unkind as to think of going, Arthur. I mean, Mr. Arthur, or I suppose Mr. Clennam would be far more proper. But I am sure I don't know what I am saying, without a word about the dear old days gone forever, When I came to think of it, I dare say it would be much better not to speak of them, and it's highly probable that you have some much more agreeable engagement, and pray let me be the last in the world to interfere with it, though there was a time. But I am running into nonsense again." Was it possible that Flora could have been such a chatterer in the days she referred to? Could there have been anything like her present disjointed volubility in the fascinations that had captivated him? "Indeed, I have little doubt," said Flora, running on with astonishing speed and pointing her conversation with nothing but commas and very few of them, "that you are married to some Chinese lady, being in China so long and being in business and naturally desirous to settle and extend your connection. Nothing was more likely than that you should propose to a Chinese lady, and nothing was more natural, I am sure, that the Chinese lady should accept you and think herself very well off too. I only hope that she's not a Pagodian dissenter." "I am not," returned Arthur, smiling in spite of himself, "married to any lady, Flora." "Oh, good gracious me, I hope you never kept yourself a bachelor so long on my account," tittered Flora. "But of course you never did. Why should you? Pray don't answer. I don't know where I'm running to. Oh, do tell me something about the Chinese ladies, whether their eyes are really so long and narrow, always putting me in mind of mother-of-pearl fish at cards, and do they really wear tails down their back, and plaited too, or is it only the men? And when they pull their hair so very tight off their foreheads, don't they hurt themselves? And why do they stick their bells all over their bridges and temples and hats and things, or don't they really do it?" Flora gave another of her old glances. Instantly she went on again, as if she had spoken in reply for some time. "Then it's all true, and they really do. Good gracious, Arthur. Pray excuse me, old habit. Mr. Clennam, far more proper. What a country to live in for so long a time, with so many lanterns and umbrellas, too. How very dark and wet the climate ought to be, and no doubt actually is, and the sums of money that must be made by those two trades, where everybody carries them and hangs them everywhere, the little shoes, too, and the feet screwed back in infancy, is quite surprising. What a traveller you are!" In his ridiculous distress, Clennam received another of the old glances, without in the least knowing what to do with it. "Dear, dear," said Flora, "only to think of the changes at home, Arthur, cannot overcome it, and seems so natural. Mr. Clennam, far more proper since you become familiar with the Chinese customs and language, that I am persuaded you speak like a native, if not better, for you are always quick and clever, though immensely difficult, no doubt. I am sure the tea-chest alone would kill me if I tried. Such changes, Arthur, I am doing it again, seem so natural, most improper, as no one could have believed, who could have ever imagined Mrs. Finching when I can't imagine it myself." "Is that your married name?" asked Arthur, struck in the midst of all this by a certain warmth of heart that expressed itself in her tone when she referred, however oddly, to the youthful relation in which they had stood to one another. "Finching? Finching, oh yes, isn't it a dreadful name? But as Mr. F. said when he proposed to me, which he did 7 times and handsomely consented, I must say, to be what he used to call on liking 12 months after all, he wasn't answerable for it and couldn't help it, could he? Excellent man, not at all like you, but excellent man." Flora had at last talked herself out of breath for one moment, for she recovered breath in the act of raising a minute corner of her pocket-handkerchief to her eye, as a tribute to the ghost of the departed Mr. F., and began again. "No one could dispute, Arthur, Mr. Clennam, that it's quite right you should be formally friendly to me under the altered circumstances. Indeed, you couldn't be anything else. At least, I suppose not, you ought to know, but I can't help recalling that there was a time when things were very different." "My dear Mrs. Finching," Arthur began, struck by the good tone again. "Oh, not that nasty, ugly name. Say Flora." "Flora. I assure you, Flora, I am happy in seeing you once more, and in finding that, like me, you have not forgotten the old foolish dreams, when we saw all before us in the light of our youth and hope." "You don't seem so," pouted Flora. "You take it very coolly, but however I know you are disappointed in me. I suppose the Chinese ladies, Mandarinesses, if you call them so, are the cause, or perhaps I am the cause myself. It's just as likely." "No, no," Clennam entreated. "Don't say that." "Oh, I must, you know," said Flora in a positive tone. "What nonsense not to. I know I am not what you expected. I know that very well." In the midst of her rapidity, she had found that out with the quick perception of a cleverer woman. The inconsistent and profoundly unreasonable way in which she instantly went on, nevertheless, to interweave their long-abandoned boy and girl relations with their present interview, made Clennam feel as if he were light-headed. "One remark," said Flora, giving their conversation, without the slightest notice to the great terror of Clennam, the tone of a love-quarrel. "I wish to make one explanation I wish to offer. When your mamma came and made a scene of it with my papa, and when I was called down into the little breakfast-room where they were looking at one another with your mamma's parasol between them, seated on 2 chairs like mad bulls, what was I to do?" "My dear Mrs. Finching," urged Clennam, "all so long ago and so long concluded. Is it worth while seriously to—" "I can't, Arthur," returned Flora, "be announced as heartless by the whole society of China without setting myself right when I have the opportunity of doing so, and you must be very well aware that there was Paul and Virginia, which had to be returned, and which was returned without note or comment. Not that I mean to say you could have written to me watched as I was, but if it had only come back with a red wafer on the cover, I should have known that it meant come to Pekin, Nanking, and what's the third place? Barefoot. My dear Mrs. Finching, you were not to blame, and I never blamed you. We were both too young, too dependent, and helpless to do anything but accept our separation. Pray, think how long ago—" gently remonstrated Arthur. "One more remark," proceeded Flora with unslackened volubility. "I wish to make one more explanation I wish to offer. For 5 days I had a cold in the head from crying, which I passed entirely in the back drawing-room. There is the back drawing-room, still on the first floor and still at the back of the house, to confirm my words. When that dreary period had passed, a lull succeeded, years rolled on, and Mr. F. became acquainted with us at a mutual friend's. He was all attention. He called next day. He soon began to call 3 evenings a week, and to send in little things for supper. It was not love on Mr. F.'s part, it was adoration. Mr. F. proposed with the full approval of Papa, and what could I do?" "Nothing whatever," said Arthur, with the cheerfullest readiness. "But what you did. Let an old friend assure you of his full conviction that you did quite right." "One last remark," proceeded Flora, rejecting commonplace life with a wave of her hand. "I wish to make one last explanation I wish to offer. There was a time ere Mr. F. first paid attentions, incapable of being mistaken, but that is past, and was not to be. Dear Mr. Clennam, you no longer wear a golden chain. You are free. I trust you may be happy here. Is Papa, who is always tiresome and putting in his nose everywhere where he is not wanted?" With these words, and with a hasty gesture fraught with timid caution, such a gesture had Clennam's eyes been familiar with in the old time, poor Flora left herself at 18 years of age, a long, long way behind, and came to a full stop at last. Or rather, she left about half of herself at 18 years of age behind, and grafted the rest onto the relict of the late Mr. F., thus making a moral mermaid of herself, which her once boy-lover contemplated with feelings wherein his sense of the sorrowful and his sense of the comical were curiously blended. For example, as if there were a secret understanding between herself and Clennam of the most thrilling nature, as if the first of a train of post-chaises and 4, extending all the way to Scotland, were at that moment round the corner, and as if she couldn't and wouldn't have walked into the parish church with him, under the shade of the family umbrella, with the patriarchal blessing on her head, and the perfect concurrence of all mankind, Flora comforted her soul with the agonies of mysterious signalling, expressing dread of discovery. With the sensation of becoming more and more light-headed every minute, Clennam saw the relict of the late Mr. F. enjoying herself in the most wonderful manner by putting herself and him in their old places and going through all the old performances, now when the stage was dusty, when the scenery was faded, when the youthful actors were dead, when the orchestra was empty, when the lights were out. And still, through all this grotesque revival of what he remembered as having once been prettily natural to her, he could not but feel that it revived at sight of him, and that there was a tender memory in it. The Patriarch insisted on his staying to dinner, and Flora signalled "Yes." Clennam so wished he could have done more than stay to dinner, so heartily wished he could have found the Flora that had been, or that never had been, and that he thought the least atonement he could make for the disappointment he almost felt ashamed of was to give himself up to the family desire. Therefore he stayed to dinner. Hanks dined with them. Hanks steamed out of his little dock at 6:15 and bore straight down for the Patriarch, who happened to be then driving in an insane manner through a stagnant account of Bleeding Heart Yard. Hanks instantly made fast to him and hauled him out. "Bleeding Heart Yard," said Hanks, with a puff and a snort. "It's a troublesome property. Don't pay you badly, but rents are very hard to get there. You have more trouble with that one place than with all the places belonging to you." Just as the big ship in tow gets the credit, with most spectators, of being the powerful object, so the Patriarch usually seemed to have said himself whatever Hanks said for him. "Indeed," returned Clennam, upon whom this impression was so efficiently made by a mere gleam of the polished head that he spoke the ship instead of the tug. "The people are so poor there.